Support comes from Gemma, architects, planners, and designers seeking to bring joy to their clients and communities. Details at gemastl.com.
This is St. Louis on the Air from St. Louis Public Radio.
I'm Danny Wysentowski, in for Elaine Cha. 10 years ago, the killing of a black teenager ignited protest and anger in the streets of St. Louis. This was not the case of Mike Brown. His death in the summer of 2014 in Ferguson became an international news story. But this was another young black man, killed 1 year later in August 2015 in St. Louis's Fountain Park neighborhood. His name was Mansur Ball-Bey. Both Mansur and Mike were just 18 years old when they died, and in both cases, the only witnesses to describe the critical moments of the shooting itself were the very police officers who pulled the triggers. And like Mike Brown, none of the officers who were involved in the death of Mansur Ball-Bey were ever charged with crimes or cross-examined on the witness stand. But Mansur Ball-Bey's case is unique, and his death is much more than a historical footnote of the Ferguson uprising. Because in January this year, a federal jury in a wrongful death lawsuit ruled in favor of Ball-Bey's family, awarding them almost $19 million. The case has ripped open a window to some of the most closely guarded secrets of the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department, and not just the investigation into how Mansur Ball-Bey was killed, but problems in other police shootings. St. Louis is fighting that judgment in court, but the impact of this case, the legacy of the life and death of Mansur Ball-Bey, is still unfolding. And we're spending the entire show today talking about this case and how it has shaken the landscape of St. Louis's criminal justice system. And I should note for our audience that later in our show we will be talking about a critical part of this case, the damage that the bullets fired by Officer Kyle Chandler did to Mansur's spine before he died. Mansur was shot in the back while running, and those details became critical to the way this case concluded. But those gruesome details are not who Mansur Ball-Bey was to his family and those who love him and still miss him. And first, joining me this hour are two of the key attorneys who led this legal fight for the last decade, Jermaine Wooten and Javad Khazaeli. Welcome to St. Louis on the Air.
Nice to be here. Thanks for having me back.
And also here with me is Dennis Ball-Bey, the father of Mansur Ball-Bey. Dennis, thank you for being here as well.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Dennis, Mansur was 18 years old in the summer of 2015. He was a recent graduate of McClure South Berkeley High School. Bring us back to that time before this tragedy. What was going on in his life? What were you two talking about at the time?
Back then, what was going on in his life, he had plans. He was getting into the music industry. Graduating, as soon as he graduated, he got his job working for FedEx. But he also had plans to go to college. He was going to take up engineering. So them was his main plans, but he stayed, I'm proud of him, he stayed focused on the things that he needed to do. You know, as a young man, he didn't run the streets, had no tech tools or nothing like that. He was active in the Moore Science Temple of America. And after he did that, while he was going to school, he was still active going to the temple like 3 times a week. Go to the temple 3 times a week, go to school, and then had time to still, be with his little one. He took care of his little sister. She had cerebral palsy. He took care of her. Once he got his driving license, he drove his mom around. When I couldn't make it around, he was able to take her places to do things that she needed to do.
So take us to this date, August 19th, 2015. How did you find out about this shooting of your son?
Yep. One of my sisters, my niece, called me. I was working. And when they called me, but they didn't give me enough information. All they said he got shot. He was in the ambulance. Son said that he's dead. I went straight to the scene. But by the time when I made it down there to the scene, it was all chaotic. It was police there, protesters there. So it was like an uproar in the community.
Jermaine, you're a longtime attorney. You were actually there with Dennis on that day. You were called in. Can you tell us kind of how you got involved in this and what you saw as Dennis was going through every parent's nightmare?
Absolutely.
Just August 19, 2014, another young man had got killed, Khazaeli Powell. So during the time Mansur had been shot, we were actually downtown protesting the 1-year anniversary involving Khazaeli Powell. So while we were down there, I had gotten a call from Dennis's niece and Mansur's cousin that her cousin had gotten shot. We need your help. So we left the protest downtown. Myself and Gerald Christmas, we went over to the scene on Page and Walton. At that time, there were a number of protesters over there on the scene. Dennis was not there when I initially had gotten there, but he had gotten there shortly thereafter. So we had a brief conversation. What he did understand is he knew how he had raised his son. He knew his son could not have done anything to deserve being shot. So I told him, hey, let us check it out. Let's find out exactly what happened to your son. And ultimately, all he really wanted was justice for his son. And we had a conversation involving justice for his son, getting the information from the police department. And for the next few days, we had several meetings. Maybe the more key meeting would have been with Dr. Michael Graham.
Yeah, and we're going to get to that medical examiner in a little bit later in our conversation. I do want to hear from Attorney Javad Khazaeli. You came onto this case as a legal representative later on, once getting closer to that civil trial that just, had that massive verdict earlier this year. But you really went into understanding that initial police response, where that medical examiner was, and really how the police narrative, the understanding of what happened first and why are these officers there. Take us a little bit into the insight you only gained later, because it sounds like this was both a chaotic situation, but also one that police quickly identified the story they were going to tell and the story they were going to stick to. What stands out about that initial reaction to you as you looked into this case?
Well, Jermaine and Gerald had done a really good job in discovery and getting a lot of evidence together. And when they wanted to put the trial team together, they brought us in. To be honest, I've got a biology degree, but I'm not a doctor in any way. It took us about 30 minutes to read all of this and realize that for the police to have told the truth, an 18-year-old would have had to have run over 100 feet, close to 120 feet, with a fully severed spine and a bullet that had gone through his aorta. And
let's set the basics of this clearly.
Huh?
Mansur is at his cousin's house. There's a police raid. He runs, and he is ultimately struck in the back.
Yeah. So I'm not trying to in any way sugarcoat this. There were some facts that weren't great. Mansur was in a bad neighborhood, and some people came through the front door of the house with guns. He ran out of the back of the house holding a gun. Now, what the evidence clearly showed was that as soon as the police officers identified themselves, he threw the gun down. And they still pursued him and shot him in the back. The gun was found 162 feet away from his body, around a corner against a dumpster. The place that the police officers claimed that Mansur was standing was 122 feet from where his body had collapsed. And when we looked at the medical report, we saw a fully severed spine and a bullet through an aorta. And as Jermaine said, when Dr. Graham originally gave the interviews, he gave an interview to the New York Times, he said, this is clear that when somebody gets shot, they immediately fall down. Then over the next few days, as the police begin to realize that this is a problem, how can a body be 160 feet away from a gun? Because the officers were adamant that Mansur was pointing a gun at them. But this didn't make sense. All of a sudden, the coroner story changes.
Now, this initial claim by the police, let's just make sure this is clear, because I think this is the thing that becomes eroded over time as we get to this more recent case. They say, Mansur was in a bad neighborhood. He was in a house with drug dealing. There was guns there. These were details that they brought as proof and suggestions that, yes, Mansur is the type of person to point a gun at a police officer. Dennis, I want to ask, though, these are all circumstances that the police threw out there about your son's character, and clearly they were trying to support this notion that these police officers were right, they were trustworthy. What did you talk with Mansur about of being in that place? Did you know he was at that house and what the circumstances were?
Well, that house is his auntie house, his cousin house. A lot of family members be over there. That house was not no drug dealing house.
Okay.
So they justified as that chasing after his cousin. So his cousins stayed in activity with the police. So they following him. So my son, Mansur ended up over there at the time. It's like at the in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Right.
So he ended up over there, but he always goes over to his cousin's house. He always visit all his family. He stayed active. He didn't run the streets. He wasn't in the streets in no gangs at all. So,
Jermaine, I want to ask you about this initial stage of this case, because you are there with Dennis. You are there with the family. This initial narrative from the medical examiner, Dr. Michael Graham, tell us, what is the first story that comes out about the circumstances of this shooting and the evidence? Do you have doubt from that early stage?
Well, having worked on a couple of police shootings up until that point, the Von Derek Myers case and Khazaeli Powell case, I had very deep reservations on the initial story told by the police officers. So with those reservations, I initially talked to a couple of people who were on the scene prior to even speaking with Dr. Graham. But upon speaking with Dr. Graham, and he confirmed directly with me that Mansur, with a severed spinal cord, could not have run at all after being shot, we knew it was a problem.
So let's be clear about this. The running is very important, okay? Because the police officers had three things they had to deal with. We knew where the body was. We knew where the gun was. Okay? We knew he's running full speed away from where the gun was. So the police, once they got their story together, their version of the story was quite simply insane. That Mansur was running full speed, turned around, pointed a gun at the officers. The officer shot him, causing the gun to leave his hand, go against his momentum and his full speed, fly 40 feet up in the air over the officer's head, hit the ground on the alleyway, take a left turn, go 6 feet, get against a dumpster, and then he would have had to run 120 feet with a severed spine and a bullet in his aorta. Because if that wasn't the version, then the version was what we think the evidence clearly showed. He ditched the gun. He never pointed the gun. He ditched it because he realized he was being chased by police, not random bad people who were trying to kill him in a city with one of the highest murder rates in America. And as soon as he realized it was the police, he threw the gun, and they chased him, and they shot at him. And then when he got through a thin walkway between two buildings where he couldn't move left or right, they shot him unarmed in the back and then had to make up the story afterwards.
We're going to be back shortly to continue this conversation about the 2015 police shooting of Mansur Ball-Bey and how, when faced with that physical evidence, the police account of this shooting became impossible for a jury to believe. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio.
This is St. Louis Public Radio. Support comes from Perrick Corporation, a contractor with over 4 decades of shaping the St. Louis landscape. More at perrick.com.
Welcome back. I'm Danny Wysentowski, in for Elaine Cha. On June 2nd, 2016, the Circuit Attorney's Office of the City of St. Louis released a remarkable report. Its 43 pages outlined the decision to not bring criminal charges against the officers who fired at Mansur Ball-Bey the previous summer, killing the 18-year-old and setting off protests. That report has not aged particularly well. Because almost a decade later, in January of this year, a federal jury sided with the family of Mansur Ball-Bey, awarding them nearly $19 million in a wrongful death lawsuit against the city of St. Louis. Mansur Ball-Bey was killed exactly 10 years ago today, on August 19, 2015. And to remember his life and to explore the still unfolding ramifications of this legal case, I'm joined by the two key attorneys who have worked on this case for a decade, Jermaine Wooten and Javad Khazaeli. And also with me here is Dennis Ball-Bey, the father of Mansur Ball-Bey. And so, Dennis, I mentioned this report. It comes out in 2016. It's the top prosecutor of the city of St. Louis, and it's the news that you've been waiting for. Will these officers be charged? And the answer is no. What is your reaction to this? Is there something about that report or about Jennifer Joyce that sticks in your memory when this moment finally comes?
Yes, it does. I feel that they didn't do no investigation with the police at all. That's how I feel. I felt that they just was going to sweep it under the rug.
Did you have some hope, or was there something about this that made you think this would be the case? They would charge these officers?
I did. But my hope came from the lawyers, really. It was the way they communicated with me at the, I don't know what type of state of mind I was in, but, like when you're losing a loved one, and then with his character being, he had a good character. So you losing a loved one like him, but it was the way the lawyers spoke with me, and I just rode with them. I never questioned them what they needed to do or nothing. It's 10 years now. It's been the same way. 10 years, I just been letting them do what they need to do.
Jermaine, you had been representing Dennis already at that point. Was this a report a blow to your legal case defending Mansur? How did you tell Dennis to not give up hope when you had this top prosecutor giving this very tough news?
Well, it wasn't really difficult because I had braced Dennis and the entire Ball-Bey family that we were not very hopeful that Jennifer Joyce would actually charge these two police officers. It just didn't appear to be advantageous for the city of St. Louis, so we were not hopeful in that regard. Upon getting a report or meeting, actually we met with Jennifer Joyce, myself, Gerald Christmas, Mr. Ball-Bey, his wife, and several members from the Moore Science Temple were there to support Mr. Ball-Bey, and Jennifer Joyce had given, just kind of briefed us on a report, things she was looking at, and it was pretty clear that no investigation by the Circuit Attorney's Office had actually taken place. They had essentially rubber-stamped what the police officers had said and just really relied on the investigation from the police officers.
I do want to ask about the officers involved. We've mentioned their names before: Kyle Chandler, Ronald Vaughn. Kyle Chandler had been on the force at the time since 2008. Ronald Vaughn was much more recent. Javad, this report, again, it exonerated them at the time. What did you learn about who these officers were and maybe some of the things that didn't make it into that report that were relevant?
By the time we got involved in this case 7 years later, we'd already known who Ronald Vaughn and Kyle Chandler are. I mean, just a few weeks ago, we settled a case where Ronald Vaughn and Kyle Chandler beat up Reverend Gray. Same officer.
As an activist, Reverend Darrell Gray, yeah.
Yeah, Reverend Gray was protesting a killing of another black man. These guys were there. They beat him up on video. Same two officers. A simple Google search would find that one of these officers, both of these officers together, had been accused of planting drugs on a person that they arrested. There was video of that. A judge in St. Louis City threw that out and basically said these officers weren't credible. Both of them, by the time the trial came about, had been fired from the department.
Yeah, and they're not on the force anymore.
No, these guys were some of the worst of the worst.
I want to stick on this report, the one that was issued in 2016 by Circuit Attorney Jennifer Joyce, because in her press conference, she made this really unusual statement for a prosecutor, and I can't think of maybe another case where I've heard a prosecutor say this. She said, "We concluded ultimately that we did not have enough evidence to prosecute this case against those officers." But she then said, quote, "I'm not saying that the shooting was justified. I would not say that. I am saying that based on the evidence that we have, there is no way that any criminal charges could be brought against these two officers." That line about that it's not justified, That line is very strange for me to hear a prosecutor mention. That sounds like what a defense attorney might say. What did you take from that line, Jermaine? You were the attorney representing the family at this. Did that line give you a clue or a hint that something was not right here?
Well, it gave me a couple clues. I think looking at it from an attorney's point of view, of course, there's a civil standard and then a criminal standard. Certainly, on the civil side, she took the position that I think these guys may be civilly liable, but we don't believe they're criminally liable. However, I think there was enough evidence, at least to make probable cause, that both officers could have been charged. And I think, and we continued even after that report, giving Jennifer Joyce additional information. We gave her an expert report that kind of showed her exactly what occurred based on the investigation that we had done, which was consistent with the information provided to the jurors, who actually came back in 90 minutes and thought, hey, this was a bad shooting.
Mm-hmm. And Javad, could you remind us, we are talking about a criminal case here. Jennifer Joyce is saying we're evaluating this for criminal charges. You eventually take this to civil trial. Could you just remind our audience of kind of the different standards here and why these two cases really are being judged in a different way?
Well, let's be clear. I think the evidence that we provided when we did a real investigation would have been enough to show beyond a reasonable doubt, which is the criminal standard, that these guys shot an unarmed man in the back. But yes, in a criminal setting, you have beyond a reasonable doubt. That means that that's about the highest burden you can come up with. That means that it's set up in a way that if you have any concerns, even if you think somebody did it, you need to acquit. Where our standard is just more than 50%. Mm-hmm. But there are a few things that let me believe that if we were the prosecutors in this case, and remember, this would be a murder. Gabe Gore could absolutely look at this case again.
The current circuit attorney.
And charge this. Mm-hmm. Okay? Especially once you read these transcripts, as I know that you've had. Even though we had the lower burden, as Jermaine will tell you, it took 90 minutes. But it was less than that. At 60 minutes, the jury came back to us and said, wait a second, if we rule in your favor, who's going to pay for this? But then there's other things to realize. This wasn't a St. Louis City jury. This was a federal jury that comes from the whole eastern side of the state. We're talking about counties like St. Francis County and all that. We had an all-white jury. The city bounced every black possible juror that they could. They bounced almost every single city juror they could. So in about 60 minutes, an all-white jury with 11 out of 12 members not being from St. Louis, ruled in our favor and gave us what I believe it's a top 3 verdict in American federal court history. This wasn't a close case. When you heard what our doctor, spine expert, not just a coroner, spine expert said, it was very clear that he was shot in the back when he was unarmed.
Dennis, I want to ask you about a couple of those points, but part of it is that these criminal charges were not brought by Jennifer Joyce, but there are folks who wait for these charges to be brought by another prosecutor. Have you reached out to Gabe Gore, and if one of the attorneys want to answer, but is this something that you would want to see, actual criminal charges brought against these officers with the strength of some of the evidence that your own attorneys have found?
Well, since the struggle still continue and it's still going on right now, yes, I would. I mean, that's still part of seeking justice.
Mm-hmm. So, even though that very large judgment, $19 million is a big message, but that is not enough for what you've lost.
That's true. That is not enough. What really got me when he said $50 million.
Was it $50 million at some point, Javad?
When we got the punitive damages, we'll get to that after the city basically said they were too broke to pay any money. We asked for 50 in punitive damages, and they gave us an additional 12.5. So, 25% return.
All right. Now, part of the reason it seems like that this number was so large is this issue with the spinal injury. We've been talking about Dr. Michael Graham a bit during this conversation. The way this spinal injury comes up, I want to focus on this for a moment. Mm-hmm. This initial autopsy and the one that makes headlines, is that there is a spinal cord break. This is a big deal because it punctures a part of the police narrative. In that first part, Javad, why was that injury so important? What was the confliction with what the police were saying in that initial state?
The police said he pointed a gun at them while he was standing near the gun and then ran away. And his body was found in a place that was so far away from the gun that made that an impossibility, which made their whole story about him pointing a gun, which is the only legal basis that they have to shoot him, that just eviscerated that.
The thing is that in Jennifer Joyce's report in 2016, she talks about this medical report, and it seems like she's resolved this contradiction. They went back and they studied the injury, and it must have been fully severed during the arrest. The bullet must have punctured his heart. In her report, when she lays out the two stories of a story where Mansur was murdered, presumably, and a story where Mansur was justifiably killed, she lays this out and says, here's how we resolved this. The spine was broken during the struggle. Why was that not a resolution that you and your team stayed with?
So first of all, that was based on a coroner's report, somebody who's not a spinal expert. And it was based on his second report, not his first report. His first report, he was clear. It was fully severed by the bullet. So we brought in a Dr. Benjamin Carlock. Dr. Carlock is a spinal specialist. He's never testified in a case before. Nobody can come out and say that he's a plaintiff's doctor. He works for the VA. He's seen thousands of spinal injuries. The moment we showed him this and we said that their argument was it could have been nicked and broken and severed later when the police fell on him, he said it was absurd. He said there are only certain things that fully sever a spine. And the things that he mentioned were bullets, knives, and buildings, things of the force of a whole building falling on you. Even he's never heard of people punching somebody so hard that they break a spine. Spines don't work that way. And having our expert come in, who any spinal doctor would have worked on this, and they talk about the structure of the spine. A spine doesn't just stand alone. It has muscles and nerves and all of this caging around it. You don't do that by nicking it and then having 5 guys fall on top of each other. If that were true, you would see fully severed spines in every NFL football game, every WWE match, every one of these fights that you see on World Star Hip Hop. You don't see that. It was so easily disprovable that it makes me think that, I think the term is they took a dive on this. As I said, I'm not a doctor. It took us one phone call and sharing this picture, and a spine person said, this is one of the most ludicrous things. And he was asked, he said he bounced this off of other doctors, and all of them said this was the most ludicrous argument.
Jermaine, you are representing the family as these reversals are almost happening. I remember these first reports coming out and the medical examiner saying, he died, it was a severed spine, and then amending that statement, as the later reporting went on. What stood out to you as this story changed in that early sense? Did it confuse you? Did you have suspicion that something nefarious was happening? It seems like the details of this come out later, but what was it like being in that moment?
Oh, the level of chicanery going on within the city and the medical examiner's office had deeply concerned us. Like I said, Dr. Graham had given us his initial impression that the spinal cord had been completely severed, and without notifying the family at all, the body was released. It's over at the funeral home. He unilaterally made a decision to go pick the body up, to do a second autopsy, to pull the spinal cord out of the body. And even when he pulled the spinal cord out of the body, the spinal cord was still completely severed, as he stated in the initial report. So then they had to figure out, we have to say something to justify this severed spinal cord, and that's when they came up with the ludicrous idea that maybe the spinal cord had been nicked and then unraveled. And then I had a second meeting with him. I said, well, how could the spinal cord have come unraveled? He said, well, maybe Jermaine, when he was riding in the vehicle on his way down to the medical examiner's office, the bouncing of bouncing around on the street that could have caused it, and that was the justification he had personally given me, and it just didn't make any sense.
We need to take a quick break, but we'll be back shortly to continue this conversation about the 2015 police shooting of Mansur Ball-Bey, and we'll continue to get the inside story of the trial that ended earlier this year in a nearly $19 million verdict for the Ball-Bey family. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio.
The Gateway brings you the day's news each weekday from around the St. Louis region and the state capitals in Jefferson City.
Our schools are accredited. We don't need this bill.
And Springfield.
How many more years must pass before lawmakers see time is of the essence?
I'm Abby Larico. Join me each weekday for The Gateway on the STLPR app or wherever you get podcasts.
Welcome back. I'm Danny Wysentowski, in for Elaine Cha. We've spent today's show looking closely at the killing of Mansur Ball-Bey. The 18-year-old was shot and killed by police in the city of St. Louis on this date 10 years ago, August 19th, 2015. After a decade of legal battles, in January, a federal jury ruled against the city of St. Louis in a wrongful death lawsuit, awarding Ball-Bey's family almost $19 million. And I'm joined today by two attorneys who have spent years working on this case as it inched toward that trial, Jermaine Wooten and Javad Khazaeli. And of course, also joining me in this conversation is Dennis Ball-Bey, the father of Mansur Ball-Bey. So before the break, we were talking about the results of an investigation by the city of St. Louis and its top prosecutor at the time of the shooting, and that investigation concluded that there wasn't enough evidence to charge these officers who had chased Mansur Ball-Bey and shot him in the back. But this trial that just concluded in January of this year couldn't have ended any differently with that $19 million verdict, with the jury unanimously disbelieving this narrative by these officers. Javad, you were the attorney at the center of this trial. Help us understand what changed between Jennifer Joyce coming out and saying we can't charge these guys and you just seemingly controlling this trial up until the last moment.
I appreciate your description of me. I think that people think that I'm the lead on these sometimes because I'm the person who will be out on TV. But we had a great team. You know, Jermaine was on the trial team, Jack Waldron, Jim Wersch from our office. Alicia Campbell was one of our attorneys that worked on one of the most brilliant jury consultants you'll ever have, too. Gerald Christmas was involved in this. So just because I'm the loud guy in front of the TV, let's not pretend like I did all the work on this.
Worthwhile. The results speak for themselves as well.
Yeah, and we do good work, and we've got a lot of these cases. I think just putting this in front of a jury in an organized fashion without all of the muddying of the water that was very intentional by the police department, and letting them see the science and letting them see this clearly, it couldn't have been easier than walking them down this path and letting them know that everything these officers said were lies. You can't possibly physically do what they said occurred. And once they put these officers on the stand, and once we put Dr. Graham on the stand, all of this fell apart.
Jermaine, I wanted to ask you about this because a lot of time had passed since you had first started working on this case with Dennis Ball-Bey, with the family. There, as Javad said, there was a lot of confusion introduced early on. What felt like the biggest difference for you as this trial began? What felt more clear when there was a mess before?
Well, I think one of the key things is we always knew what happened, what occurred. I think one of the initial meetings I had with Javad and the other members of the team, and we're talking maybe 2 or 3 years before the trial, as soon as they took a glance at the case, I had handed them the file. They took a peek at the case. Within about 25 minutes, they called me back, and they understood, hey, it's a problem here. And that was only just taking a cursory look at the case. the same kind of look that the Ball-Bey family had really wanted Jennifer Joyce to take a look at. And once we had dove into the investigation, the entire trial team, everything just kind of really played out perfectly in the trial from opening to closing.
Dennis, this trial was also a chance for you to tell the jury about your son's life. You and his mother testified. Photos were shown of him. What was that opportunity like? What were you trying to get, and what were you hoping that jury learned about Mansur, even as they were seeing the terrible way that he had died?
Yes, I was pleased with the jury because they were looking at me, and they was like waiting to hear the story that I told about Mansur, the way he was living, his character, his character wasn't the type that you could see like a person that's running the streets or whatever. So telling them about him going to school, about him working, about him going to the temple, I think they really looked at that a lot.
What was that moment like, the verdict, when did it hit you?
Yes, it did. It was like that felt so good to be relieved. The money didn't have nothing to do with it. What they awarded me didn't have nothing to do. I just felt so good that his name was cleared.
And you mentioned, the money didn't have anything to do with it. And at this point, there is no money yet because the city is fighting this judgment. And Javad, I want to ask you about this because you just described this case as so blatantly winnable when you went into it. And yet the city of St. Louis fought you on this, and it seems like they're willing to continue. What are they saying about why, this judgment should be struck down or they need a new trial? What's their overall argument for this?
So let's be clear. When the city makes these ridiculous arguments, it's costing the taxpayer $62,000 a month because this verdict has an interest rate that will run on this. Basically, their strongest argument is, now remember, the police officers had no idea who Mansur was. They weren't looking for Mansur. They didn't recognize Mansur. They'd never heard of Mansur. Their strongest argument is that after Mansur Ball-Bey died, they found pictures on Instagram of Mansur Ball-Bey smoking weed. So they argued that the jury should be able to see that because their theory was that, this is what they said in court, that because he was a weed smoker, it makes it more likely he would point a gun at a police officer. I've got friends who are weed smokers. They are the slowest people I know. They're not running around anywhere. They're sleeping on couches. But this idea, and it was very clear what they're doing then and what they're doing now. They're trying to slime Mansur. They're trying to basically argue maybe he didn't point a gun at a police officer, but his life didn't matter. And so him dying is just another black kid off the streets that eventually would be a criminal. It's gross. It's disgusting. And they're not going to get away with it. And it's laughable when you put that against what the law is.
And I read a bit of the filings that the city had put in its motion of why it should have a new trial. And Jermaine, I'm curious of kind of your takeaway because there were points where it was basically sounded like they were saying it's unfair that you were able to introduce evidence of these police officers being potentially abusive or having their background, and we can't bring in that Mansur was smoking weed or whatever evidence that they felt should have been presented to the jury. What was your reaction to this argument that somehow the city didn't have enough of an opportunity to slime Mansur's reputation or to show him as deserving of this end as he was? It's a very bizarre thing to read.
Oh, no, it's completely ludicrous. And I think I concur what Javad said. The police officers had no idea who Mansur was. And I think the judge gave a fair ruling based on the fact that they didn't know who Mansur was when they entered the home. When they shot Mansur, they took a look at Mansur, they did not know who he was. They thought Mansur actually was another relative, but they didn't know who Mansur was. Mansur would come down to that house maybe once or twice a month, only as a come down there to see his family. It was his aunt's home. His cousin and a number of other family members lived in that house. But Mansur, all in all, was not a good kid. He actually was a great kid. And the judge gave fair rulings for both plaintiff and defense in this matter. We wanted to get evidence in laying out what kind of kid Mansur was. Mansur was a A student over at Berkeley South. Mansur had perfect attendance. Mansur worked as soon as he graduated high school, he got him a job over at FedEx. He applied for University of Missouri over at Rolla. He had plans on being an engineer. We wanted to get all that information in. The judge didn't allow us to get that information in. Likewise, she didn't allow the city to get the information they were trying to get in. So the judge gave fair rulings on both ends.
You know, as I've mentioned, there has now been 10 years that this case has taken in the history of this city. There's been a lot of events that have happened in the police department. The state has now taken it over. There have been other young black men who've been killed. There have been protests. There's been a trial of a police officer on murder charges where that did not end in a guilty verdict again on a lot of these similar issues. You and your fellow attorneys have worked on a lot of these cases. Is there something, is St. Louis improving? Is it changing in the way that it handles these cases? Is it sticking its heels in?
I don't think so. I think they're pretty consistent at not really doing a thorough and efficient investigation when we have these police shootings. And it always concerned me, specifically this case here. The Von Derek Myers case, that was an investigation that there was not much of an investigation by the Force Investigative Unit. And then once we dove in a little bit, we realized the Force Investigative Unit had not investigated any of these cases.
Now, I want to ask Javad about this because I saw you react as I asked if the St. Louis had improved in these investigations. And, in our last minutes, this is the other thing that is cracked out of this case. I spoke with Tony Messenger of the Post-Dispatch about this a couple times. The Force Investigative Unit had all of these reports on many dozens of shootings. You got access to an audit of this unit, and the reality of the way that this unit is investigating police shootings is startling, and it includes dozens of errors in every single investigation, from minor errors to seemingly ones that could be substantial. Javad, did we learn and kind of see the beating heart of this problem in the Force Investigative Unit and its failures here?
So let's be clear. We were not given the Force Investigation Unit documents. They were hidden from us for years, hidden from dozens of attorneys in dozens of cases, pretended like they didn't exist. The last deposition in this case, one of the people used to be the head of it. And in the last hour, he said, "Stop asking me these questions. You should get the questions out of the audit." And we said, "What audit?" And the city pretended it didn't exist. It took us almost 2 years to get the audit. And your description's exactly right. And the question of, is it getting better? Well, Gabe Gore, the current circuit attorney, just said this week his office is not going to investigate the backlog of police shootings. Instead, he's going to kick it back to this Force Investigation Unit and have the, what is this? The fox guarding the hen house. And the reason is because they don't have the manpower. And let me tell you how ridiculous that is, okay? I've been on this show several times. We represent the owners of Bar PM, the gay bar that the police crashed into, beat up the owners, and then charged them. One owner is charged with a misdemeanor. You know who's prosecuting him? Gabe Gore's office. And you know which prosecutors are on the misdemeanor case? Their head homicide prosecutor and the head of their litigation unit. They've got the resources for that on a misdemeanor case, but we don't have the resources anymore to investigate state actors killing citizens. And we're going to give that back to the police because they've done such a good job. That's insane.
To pull things back at the Force Investigative Unit, one of the things that is just startling as you take a step back on this case, that the head of that unit, Roger Engelhardt, he was at the scene. He was one of the first people, it seems like, investigating this shooting. And he knew, it seems like, from the very early stages that something was really, really wrong with this spinal cord injury and shooting. Jermaine, you have such a perspective on this. How do you handle almost like the knowledge that there was someone with authority who knew there was a problem, who saw that contradiction, and seemingly was not able to tell the truth, not able to make this a better situation until you put him on the stand to get that information out of him? How do you look at that?
Well, it was pretty clear early on that Roger Englehart maybe received that job as the head of the Force Investigative Unit just to do exactly what he was doing as a chief of that unit, and that's absolutely nothing. He didn't investigate these shootings. In fact, what he actually did was made sure that the officers, he would had enough time, a couple of days before, anywhere from 2 to 5 days before he actually did the initial interview. And many times, instead of asking them open questions, he would actually ask leading questions so they would not incriminate themselves. And he was very consistent in doing that as we went through the number of reports, not only in the Mansur Ball-Bey case, but in many of the cases that he led the investigations on.
I would say that is one of the bases that the city's using to try to get a new trial. They think it was unfair for us to point out that all of the witnesses who weren't police officers were asked questions in a room with video immediately afterwards. But the officers who were on the scene weren't asked any questions until there was a public statement as to what the narrative was. Then they all were brought in 3, 4, 5, 6 days later. They all came in sharing the same attorneys. None of their interviews were videoed. And the city of St. Louis is saying that us pointing that out is crazy, that we should not have been allowed to do that. I will say one thing that Roger Englehart did do, though, was when he testified, he explained what happened with Dr. Graham. He said when he went in and pointed out to Dr. Graham that the spine was severed and that Mansur couldn't run, he told him that the chief of police was on the phone and was not happy about that because he thought that there would be more protests. Quote, I think Roger Englehart said, well, this means that the city's going to burn down. And Roger's testimony was that Graham, because of that, said, oh, give me a few minutes. And then he came up with this new insane theory that the spine, within minutes, that the spine was severed because people jumped on his back.
You know, I covered that protest and that threat that the city's going to burn. You know, there were buildings that burned that night, and there were people who were angry. But I remember talking to folks who told me, you know, the reason we're angry is because the police treat us the same no matter what we do, and this is not getting fixed. You know, we can't have another dead child, essentially. I know he was 18, but that is too young, obviously. Dennis, as we close here, is there something you want to leave folks with? You are embarking on another part of your life. Maybe, you know, this judgment, this amount of money, it'll happen in the future, or who knows if it'll be another long road. What do you want people to know about how folks in your position are finding that hope and that strength? What do you want them to pay attention to as they might see another case like this, as they continue to listen to police and ask the police to do better?
I think that they should never give up. You know, even right now, we still struggling, but we still haven't given up. So if they keep that faith, keep their faith to keep struggling for what they feel that's going to be righteous, I think they'll feel better with themselves.
Is there any final memory of Mansur or something that he told you that you'd like to leave us with?
With me, he loved the temple, though. Mansur was like, in our temple, like, you know, like you have ushers in the church or whatever. He was like one of them kind of active members. Just volunteer. You don't get paid for this or nothing. But he just like doing stuff around in the temple. So I kind of missed that. And the members miss him too because he held this one post up under the flag. So when everybody come in and sit in the temple, he'd be like sitting right there up under this flag.
And so they saw him.
Be missed.
Yeah, he was always there, and then he wasn't. Dennis Ball-Bey is the father of Mansur Ball-Bey. Thank you so much for being here and sharing the memory of your son with us.
I hope to see y'all again.
And Jermaine Wooten is a longtime defense attorney in St. Louis with Legal Solutions Group. Jermaine, thank you for being here as well.
Thank you for having us.
And Javad Khazaeli is an attorney with the St. Louis firm Khazaeli Wersch. Javad, thank you as always.
Thanks for having me again.
This episode was produced by Danny Wissentowski.
Audio engineering and podcast design by Aaron Dorr.
Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations, and leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thank you.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.